The letter arrived on a Thursday, which Saoirse Dunmore had always considered an unlucky day, though she could never have said precisely why. She read it, standing at the kitchen window of Dunmore Hall, still wearing her barn coat, her riding gloves tucked under her arm. The morning light was thin and grey, the kind that made everything look slightly older than it was. The stone walls, the empty paddocks, the elm trees her grandfather had planted along the lane. She read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and set it on the windowsill beside a cracked teacup that no one had bothered to throw away. The letter was from her cousin, Prentice Holst. He had written to inform her, with considerable warmth and very little apology, that he intended to contest the inheritance of Dunmore Hall. Her father had died without a will properly witnessed. The property, Prentice argued, should pass through the male line. He had a solicitor in Edinburgh. He had a timeline. He wrote, terribly sorry for her loss. He was not sorry at all, of course. Saoirse had known Prentice since childhood, when he used to arrive at the hall each summer with his father and eat the best of everything, and complain about the softness of the mattresses. He had always looked at Dunmore Hall the way some people look at things they feel they have been cheated out of. She set his letter down and went to feed the horses. There were 2 of them now. There had been 4 when her father was alive, and before that, 8, and before that. The Dunmore stables had been spoken of across the whole of Perthshire. What remained was a chestnut gelding named Biscuit, who was 17 and increasingly arthritic, and a broad grey mare named Coppin, who had spent the first 6 years of her life pulling a grain wagon for a neighbouring farm before Saoirse's father had purchased her on impulse at a country auction, bringing her home in the back of a borrowed trailer while her mother sat in the passenger seat in horrified silence. Coppin was not elegant. She was not fast. She had a wide, flat back, heavy legs, and a habit of stopping to smell things at inconvenient moments. The local farrier had once looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is trying to be kind and said only, "Well, she's very solid." Saoirse loved her completely. She measured out the feed that morning with the same care she gave to everything. Not excessive, not insufficient, and stood for a while with her hand resting on Coppin's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal through her palm while the cold pressed in from the open stable door. Dunmore Hall was quiet around her. It was always quiet now. She had 3 months to resolve the situation before Prentice's solicitor filed the first formal objection. She had a meeting with her own solicitor the following week. She had a small amount of money in an account her father had kept separate, which her mother didn't know about, and which Saoirse was saving with the discipline of someone who understood that nothing lasts forever and everything has a price. What she did not have was the Dunmore name behind her anymore, not in the way it once meant something. The family had sold the east pastures 15 years ago, then the timber rights, then the fishing on the lower stream. The hall itself was mortgaged twice over. People in the village still called her Miss Dunmore, with the same inflection they might use for a duchess. But she had walked through enough rooms to know the difference between respect and habit. She finished with the horses and went inside to make tea. It was her neighbour, old Mr. Fenwick. Not the Lord Fenwick from the county, just a retired schoolteacher, who happened to share the name, who told her about the Cavendish estate trials. He mentioned it one evening in April when she'd stopped by to drop off the eggs. His hens had stopped producing, standing on his doorstep with a bag in each hand, telling her that Lord Cavendish up at Braemore Park was hosting the annual cross-country trials again this year, inviting estates from across the region, and that the rumour was he planned to use the event to evaluate potential tenants for the western parcels he'd been holding empty for 3 seasons. "Land," Saoirse said. "Good land," Mr. Fenwick said, the kind your grandfather would have known what to do with. She thought about it for a week before she entered. The trials were not a race exactly. They were a test of horsemanship across open country, stone walls, water crossings, wooded tracks, open fell, the kind of riding that had nothing to do with showing, and everything to do with whether a horse and rider understood each other well enough to cover difficult ground and the end of a long when everything hurt and the light was going. Estates entered their best horses. It was, by tradition, a social event as much as anything else, a way for the county gentry to compare bloodlines and make conversation over good whiskey afterward. Saoirse entered Coppin. She did not make a formal announcement of this. She simply paid the entry fee and wrote the mayor's name in the registry, and it was only when the list was posted outside the Braemore Park gatehouse on the morning of the trials that anyone saw it. C. Dunmore, riding Coppin, listed between Lord Maitland's imported Hanoverian mare and the Hartley family's young bay gelding, who had placed second at the Blair Athol trials the previous autumn. She heard the laughter before she saw where it came from. She was walking Coppin toward the staging area, holding the lead rein loose, when a group of riders near the paddock gate fell quiet for a moment, and then one of them, not troubling to lower his voice, said, "Good God! Is that a draft horse?" The other voices followed. Not cruel exactly. More the sound of people who find something amusing without particularly thinking about whether they should. She kept walking. She had learned to do that. It was one of the first things her father had taught her. Not with words but by example. When the creditors came, when the neighbors whispered, when the bank sent its men to assess the property, and they walked through the hall with their clipboards and their careful expressions. You kept walking. You looked at the thing in front of you, and you kept walking. Lord Cavendish of Braemore was not among the men who had laughed. She noticed this only later, turning it over in her mind, the way you notice the absence of something before you can name what it was. He was standing near the water crossing when she first saw him properly. A tall man, perhaps 35, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for most of its life. He was watching the other riders warm up with the attentiveness of someone who is actually looking, not simply appearing to look. When Coppin passed him on the way to the start line, he watched the mare with an expression Saoirse could not immediately read. Not dismissal, not mockery. She filed it away and focused on the course. The Braemore cross-country was 7 kilometers across mixed terrain, beginning on the open fell above the park and descending through 2 kilometers of birchwood before crossing the Braemore. Burn 3 times in succession, and climbing back out onto high ground for the final approach. It had been designed generations ago, for exactly the kind of horse that wasn't in fashion anymore. Not the beautiful, nervous animals built for speed, but horses with the deep lungs and steady feet for country that did not accommodate mistakes. The Hanoverian mare entering before her moved with breathtaking precision. Clean over the first wall, beautiful through the wood. Saw watched from the start line, genuinely admiring. Then she moved Coppin forward and they went. The first kilometer was straightforward, open ground, good footing. The morning still cool enough that Coppin moved with the comfortable authority of an animal in her element. Saoirse did not push her. That was the whole of the strategy, if you could call it one. Do not push her. Do not argue with her. Do not try to make her into something she wasn't. Just ask for what she had and let her give it at her own pace. The stone wall at the top of the first ridge was 4 feet with a blind landing on the far side. The young bay gelding from the Hartley estate had refused it twice during the warm-up, and his rider had been working him with increasing agitation all morning, which Saoirse had noted without comment. Coppin approached the wall at a collected canter, her ears forward. Unhurried, she cleared it by 6 inches, landed solid as furniture, and moved on without breaking stride. The wood was where the field began to thin. 3 riders came to grief in the birches. Not serious falls, but refusals and run-outs that added time, that broke the rhythm that was everything in country like this. The footing was soft and irregular, and horses, who weren't accustomed to working through uncertainty, began to find the trees and the shadows and the sudden changes of ground unnerving. Coppin walked through it, like a woman crossing a room she'd crossed 1,000 times. Sure-footed, unhurried, completely unimpressed by the Birchwood's attempts at drama. They came out above the burn crossing, and Sire pulled her back to a walk for a moment, not because Coppin needed it, but because she wanted to feel the animal under her, solid and present and right, before the hardest part of the course. Below them, the burn ran cold and quick over stones. The far bank was steep enough to require a horse that trusted its own legs. She asked Coppin forward. The mare entered the water without hesitation. The cold closed over her fetlocks, then her knees, the current pushing at her broad chest, and she crossed with the calm deliberateness of an animal who had crossed 1,000 streams exactly like it and found them all manageable. Up the far bank, scrambling a little, finding purchase, hauling them both up onto solid ground, and then the second crossing, and the third, each the same, each taken with the same workmanlike patience. By the time they came up onto the high ground for the final approach, Saoirse could see 3 horses ahead of her in the distance. She could also see, from the way they were moving, the Hanoverian carrying her neck differently now, the bay beginning to shorten his stride. That the course had taken something from them that it had not taken from Coppin. She asked the mare for more. It was the first time she'd asked it all morning. She felt Coppin consider the request. There was always a moment with this horse where you could feel the decision being made. And then the mare opened up, not into a gallop, but into something between that and a canter. Something capacious and ground-eating and completely sustainable, as if she had simply been waiting to be asked. They passed the first horse at the 3/4 mark, then the second. The Hanoverian mare was 10 lengths ahead and flagging visibly, her elegant action beginning to deteriorate into something more desperate, her rider asking and asking and asking. Saoirse did not ask. She simply maintained what Coppin had offered and let the ground come to them. They did not catch the Hanoverian. There was not enough distance left, and Saoirse was not the sort of person who would push a horse past its comfort to win a cross-country trial. They crossed the finish line second, with Coppin moving at the same pace she'd maintained for the last kilometre, not winded, not distressed, not asking to stop. The kind of horse who finishes a hard day looking as though she might reasonably go and do it again. For a moment after they crossed, there was silence. Then someone began to applaud. Not the polite applause of an audience who has seen something expected. The kind that starts without planning, because a person saw something and felt something, and the clapping came before the thought. Saoirse dismounted and ran her hand down Coppin's neck. The mare turned her head to look at her with the same unhurried expression she always wore, and Saoirse said, quietly, "Good girl," and meant it with her whole heart. It was Lord Cavendish who came to her first, not the grooms, not the officials. He came himself, across the grass, while the Hanoverian's rider was still being congratulated by a cluster of admirers who hadn't watched the last 2 kilometres as carefully as they might have. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Coppin, the way she'd noticed him looking at the horses earlier. Actually looking, not performing an opinion. "I've not seen that mare before," he said. "Where does she come from?" "A grain farm outside Aberfeldy," Saoirse said. "My father bought her at auction 8 years ago. She spent the first part of her life in harness." Something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise. Something more deliberate than that. "She never tired," he said. "I watched from the top of the ridge. She never once tired." No, Saoirse said. She doesn't. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mare, and Saoirse did not fill the silence. She had learned that too. That silence was not always an invitation to explain yourself. Miss Dunmore, he said eventually, and she understood from his tone that he'd known who she was before he crossed the grass. I wonder whether you might join me for tea. There are some matters I would like to discuss with you if you're willing. She studied him with the same directness she gave to everything. He met it without flinching. Regarding the Western parcels, she said. A brief pause. Among other things. She looked at Coppin, who was cropping the grass at the end of her rein with absolute contentment. I'll need to see to my horse first, she said. Of course, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, straightforward, without the edge of impatience that wealthy men sometimes couldn't quite keep out of their voices when they were made to wait. That made her look at him again. 15 minutes, she said. He nodded and went back across the grass. The tea was brought to a small room at the side of the great house, a room that smelled of books and wood smoke, and that looked out over the west pastures. The ones she'd been turning over in her mind since Mr. Fenwick mentioned them. They were good land. She could see it from here. The drainage, the slope, the way the light sat on the grass. Lord Cavendish poured the tea himself, which surprised her. She had expected an estate of this scale to require at least one person standing between the teapot and the cup. The western parcels have been untenanted for 3 seasons, he said, sitting across from her. The previous arrangement fell through. I've had several approaches from interested parties. None of them suited you, she said. None of them suited the land, he said. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, and she recognized in it the same logic she applied to horses and to everything else. The thing had requirements, and those requirements were what they were, regardless of what the interested party preferred. She folded her hands in her lap. You should know that my family's position is not what it was, she said. I won't misrepresent that. The hall has debts. My cousin is contesting the inheritance. I have capital enough to begin properly if the terms allowed for it, but not to sustain losses in the first year. He looked at her steadily. You just rode a grain farm mare to 2nd place in the Braemore trials. That's not the same thing as running a tenancy. No, he agreed. But it suggests a particular quality of judgment that I find more persuasive than capital. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to soften over the west pastures, going golden and slow. The land will need drainage work on the north section, she said. I could see it from the finish line. The grass is sitting too wet. He blinked. Just once, quickly. It is, he said. I've had 2 surveyors who didn't notice. They weren't looking at it at the right time of day, she said. The water table shows in afternoon light. Something settled in his expression then. Not quite respect. She didn't need his respect. Exactly. More the look of someone who has been searching for a particular word in a foreign language for a long time, and has finally heard it used correctly by a native speaker. They talked for another hour. She asked about the terms. He told her. She revised 2 clauses on the spot, giving her reasons with the precision of someone who had spent a considerable number of sleepless nights working through exactly these problems. He agreed to 1 revision immediately. The second he said he would need to consider. The first growing season is the critical one, she said, setting down her teacup. You lose it, and the soil structure takes 3 years to recover. I'm not in a position to absorb 3 years. I understand that, he said, and then, after a pause, I'm aware of your cousin's claim. She looked at him directly. It has no legal merit, he said. I had my solicitor review the relevant statutes when your name came through the entry list this morning. Your father's will is sufficient as witnessed. Prentice Holst is hoping you don't know that. She held very still. you had your solicitor review my legal situation this morning. Yes, because my name was on a horse trial entry list. Because your name was on a list, he said, and I had heard it before, and I wanted to know whether the situation was what I suspected it to be. The afternoon light moved across the floor between them. You might have told me this at the beginning of the conversation, she said. Yes, he said. I might have. She studied him for a long moment. There was, she thought, a particular kind of man who did things in a particular order for reasons he didn't always explain immediately, and who was not a fool, and who was not cruel, but who had been in the habit of his own authority for long enough that he sometimes forgot other people were not inside his head. She had known worse kinds of men. I'll want the drainage clause in writing before I sign anything, she said. I expected you would, he said. She stood, and he stood. She looked out the window once more at the west pastures, and he stood beside her and looked too. And for a moment they were both simply looking at the same piece of land. Saoirse, she said, not entirely sure why she was saying it, except that the afternoon had been what it had been, and there seemed no reason now for the formalities they'd started with. A pause. Calder, he said. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the land, mapping the drainage patterns in her head, already thinking about what the north section would need and when. The Hanoverian was beautiful, she said. She was, he agreed. Coppin will outlast her. I know, he said. That's why I came across the grass. She picked up her gloves from the table. The afternoon was going, and she had horses to feed, and a solicitor's letter to write, and 3 months of hard work ahead of her, and she had always worked best when she could see exactly what the ground required. She had seen it now. She went to find her horse, and rode home through the long light, the grey mare moving beneath her, with that steady, unfailing pace, unhurried, uncomplaining, entirely sure of where her feet were going. The hall sat at the end of the lane, just as it always had, older looking in this light than in any other, the elms throwing their long shadows across the gravel. But Saoirse looked at it differently than she had that morning. It had always been hers. She had simply needed the afternoon to remember it.